In 1218, the world changed. From the frozen steppes of East Asia, a new political entity, the Mongols, emerged, upsetting the ancient balance between the Muslim, Christian, and Confucian empires. In the western part of the Mongol world, a powerful empire held the frontier, the Khwarezmian Empire, the center of power in Central Asia and Persia. The Khwarezmians were no upstarts. Drawing on the foundations of the Seljuk dynasty and the scholarly currents of the Muslim world, the empire controlled nearly the entire ancient trade corridor, from the Oxus, Amu Darya, to the Persian Gulf, from the Caspian Sea to the foothills of the Hindu Kush. The capital city of Gurganj, modern Khiva, was resplendent with mosques, academies, and bazaars, a medieval Babylon. The cities of Nishapur, Herat, Balkh, Samarkand, and Bukhara were the jewels of the Silk Road. The throne was then held by Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, a self-styled Shah of Shahs, who believed that no power could eclipse his own. Under him, a vast empire reached its peak, but one that was riddled with serious flaws. The army was large but scattered. Local generals held their own, and the court was riven by factions and ambitions. The king's arrogance clouded his strategic vision. In the east, a man was about to change history. Temujin, now Genghis Khan, the great Khan of 10,000 men, who had united the Mongol tribes and established a new empire based on iron discipline, absolute loyalty, and unparalleled speed. In 1218, having completed the pacification of the Western Xia and Jin in China, Genghis Khan turned his gaze west. The initial goal was not war, but trade. He sent a caravan of merchants to the city of Otrar, the eastern gateway to Khwarezm. Wishing to establish peaceful relations and expand trade, he also sent an official envoy to Gurganj for direct negotiations, including a caravan of 450 merchants, loaded with silk, gold, jade, and medicinal herbs, to Otrar. Accompanying them were 3 diplomatic envoys, carrying personal letters to Shah Muhammad, requesting the establishment of formal trade relations. But what happened next was unexpected. Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, arrested and killed the entire caravan, accusing it of espionage. When Genghis Khan's envoys came to demand an explanation, Shah Muhammad not only refused to deal with Inalchuk, but also had one of the 3 envoys executed. A taboo in ancient Eurasian diplomatic traditions, shaved and humiliated the other 2 and sent them back to the east. For the Mongols, this was the ultimate insult, a declaration of war. Genghis Khan was furious. "The messenger who carries my words carries my honor," he told his generals. Over the next 3 years, from Otrar to Samarkand, from Bukhara to Nishapur, from Khorasan to the Caspian Sea, the entire Khwarezmian Empire would be in flames. No wall was thick enough, no river deep enough to stop the Mongol hooves. The cultural centers of Islam were burned, and blood flowed like rivers, not just symbolically, but in fact, recorded by contemporary historians in tears and ashes. And so began the story of an empire that dared to mock the Mongols, and paid with its entire civilization. In September 1218, in the middle of a barren land on the banks of the Sir Darya River, the city of Otrar, located on the eastern edge of the Khwarezmian Empire, became the epicenter of a historic event. This was the place where, not with swords, but with a wrong diplomatic decision, it led to a revenge of apocalyptic proportions. In early 1219, Genghis Khan convened a great military conference on the Altai steppe. It was more than a military event. It was a trial of history. The entire Mongol court agreed that this insult could not be tolerated, and so the campaign to completely destroy the Khwarezmian Empire was approved. That summer, he assembled the largest force the Mongols had ever deployed to the west. Some 150,000 men, including the main force led by Genghis Khan and his three sons, Yochi, Chagatai, and Ogedei, and a surprise attack force commanded by the talented generals Jebe and Subutai. The first target of the campaign was where it all began, the city of Otrar, a frontier stronghold of the Khwarezmian Empire, located near the confluence of the Syr Darya River's branches, on the southern steppes of present-day Kazakhstan. It was here that Governor Inalchuk had arrested and executed a caravan of Mongol merchants, planting the seed for the storm of vengeance now thundering toward him. In early autumn of 1219, the Mongol main army crossed the Syr Darya from the northeast. Genghis Khan split his forces into multiple columns, sending his sons Chagatai and Ogedei to lead an elite detachment toward Otrar. This force included infantry, siege engineers, and mobile cavalry units, tasked with intercepting any reinforcements from nearby cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. With them came massive trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers, proof of the Mongols' integration of Central Asian siegecraft into their war machine. The siege began around September 1219 and lasted for nearly 5 months, an unusually long time for the Mongols, who were renowned for their speed and shock tactics. Inalchuk, trusted by Shah Ala ad-Din, had gathered about 20,000 defenders inside the city, hoping to hold out long enough for relief to arrive. He ordered the gates shut, fortified the weakest parts of the walls, and stockpiled food, turning Otrar into an isolated fortress amid the cold steppe. But determination could only last so long. The Mongols pounded the walls with relentless bombardment and launched constant probing assaults to wear down the defenders' morale. Famine, cold, and disease began to plague the city. By late winter, a turning point came. A group of officers under Inalchuk, desperate and doubting his leadership, betrayed him. They secretly opened a southern gate, possibly Bab al-Jibalia, at dawn, allowing the Mongols to pour in. Otrar fell. Mongol troops swept through the marketplace, slaughtering surrendering soldiers and civilians alike, torching granaries, and dismantling the city's entire defensive network. Inalchuk, who had retreated to the inner citadel, was eventually captured alive. Genghis Khan, reportedly furious over the massacre of his envoys, ordered a punishment that was both symbolic and brutal. Molten silver poured down Inalchuk's throat, a blood-stained message condemning not only greed, but the treachery against the sacred laws of diplomacy. After the fall of Otrar, Genghis Khan did not stop. His next targets were the two crown jewels of the Khwarezmian Empire, Bukhara and Samarkand. Both cities were not only economic, military, and religious centers, but also the pride of what was once the most brilliant Islamic civilization in Central Asia. But then, within weeks, they burned under the hooves of the Mongols. In early 1220, after the complete destruction of Otrar, Genghis Khan divided his army into 3 wings. The Central Army, commanded by Genghis Khan himself, crossed the Syr Darya River near Otrar and advanced southwestward along the Zarafshan Valley toward Bukhara. Meanwhile, his 2 sons, Ogedei and Chagatai, led another army, approaching Samarkand from the north, ready to coordinate the next attack. The southern army, commanded by Subutai and Jebe, was circling down to Khorasan, aiming to cut off the Khwarezm army's retreat and divide Shah Muhammad's battle line. Genghis Khan approached Bukhara in late winter. Despite the harsh weather, the Mongols crossed the Nuratau Mountains, marching at high speed with light cavalry, taking Bukhara completely by surprise. Shah Muhammad was in the west, believing that the snowy mountains would stop the enemy. Bukhara had a garrison of about 20,000 men, plus armed militia. However, against the skilled troops and their brilliant siege tactics, the citadel was breached in just 3 days. The Mongols used catapults, siege towers, and stormtroopers, and after the defenders were forced into the central fortress, it was also destroyed in less than a week. After the victory, Genghis Khan gathered the people in the Great Mosque, where he preached that it was the scholars, clergy, and nobles who had angered Allah with their greed and treachery. It was a shocking psychological war, and a rare occasion when a non-Muslim stood on the pulpit of one of Islam's holiest cities. Bukhara was sacked. Many scholars, merchants, and civilians were killed. Skilled craftsmen were taken alive and taken to the east. The city was reduced to ashes. Immediately after the fall of Bukhara, Genghis Khan joined forces with Ogedei and Chagatai at the gates of Samarkand. This was the de facto capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, where Shah Muhammad had once held court before fleeing. Samarkand was better defended. It had over 100,000 soldiers, according to some accounts including slaves and militia, high walls, deep moats, and a central fortress. The city was confident it could hold out. But Genghis Khan organized a full siege, using siege techniques learned from the Chinese: mines, wooden carts, heavy stone launchers, and especially an engineering team using engineers captured from Beijing. At the same time, he lured the defending cavalry out with provocations, then outflanked them one by one. Finally, after 7 days of resistance, Samarkand fell. Shah Muhammad, who was fleeing towards the Caspian Sea, could do nothing to save the capital. In the aftermath of the battle, some 100,000 people were killed and thousands were taken into slavery. The name of Samarkand, once called the jewel on the crown of the Muslim world, was buried in ashes. With the successive fall of Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand, the heart of the Khwarezmian Empire collapsed within a few months. The entire northeastern defense line was completely penetrated. The generals were divided, unable to coordinate any significant counterattacks. The population began to flee westward, creating an unprecedented wave of migration. More importantly, Genghis Khan combined military might with psychological warfare, burning cities, executing religious icons, but sparing craftsmen, creating the impression that if one submitted, there was still a way to survive. This caused many strongholds to surrender without a fight, extending the path to Khwarezm's destruction. When Shah Muhammad fled west after his defeat at Transoxiana, he abandoned Khorasan, the most glorious heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, to its fate. In late 1220, Genghis Khan ordered his 2 generals, Subutai and Jabi, to lead an army of some 30,000 cavalry across the Kizilkum Desert, straight into Khorasan. This was no longer a campaign of conquest. It was an execution for a civilization. No one believed that a large army could cross the Kizilkum, the thirsty land that stretched between the Oxus and Persia. But the Mongols moved like the wind, breaking into small, mobile formations, using local scouts and plundering supplies on the spot. In early 1221, they suddenly appeared outside Merv, one of the oldest and largest cities in Islam, once known as the Moon in the East. Merv fell into chaos. After 6 days of siege and storming the gates with siege engines, the Mongols poured in. The population had no time to evacuate. Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, ordered the execution of the entire population. A massacre described by historians such as Juvayni as killing up to 700,000 people, although the actual figure may have been lower. But there were no survivors. The great library, the mosque, the bazaar, all were burned to the ground. A few days later, Merv was reduced to a mass grave of ashes. From Merv, The army split into two groups. One group headed west toward Herat, while the other, under the command of Tolui and Jebe, headed south toward Nishapur, the birthplace of the poet Omar Khayyam. In early April 1221, they reached the foot of the city. An unexpected event occurred. Genghis Khan's son-in-law was ambushed and killed near the city. In his fury, Tolui ordered the entire city to be destroyed. Nishapur surrendered in despair, but the surrender did not bring life. Individuals were taken to the outskirts of the city, divided into groups, men, women, children, and executed. Some accounts say that each soldier was assigned to kill 300 to 400 people to practice his skills. These figures, however exaggerated, cannot deny a cold historical truth. Nishapur had disappeared from the map as if it had never existed. Herat, in the summer of 1221, was the last Khorasan stronghold to retain an organized defense. With some 50,000 soldiers and militia, they held out for weeks. But after the walls were breached, Herat met the same fate as the cities before it. Not only was it sacked, but its people were enslaved, and its artisans were forcibly taken to Karakoram to serve the Mongol court. Herat was not burned to the ground, but its spirit was dead. As Khorasan fell, Shah Muhammad, without a capital, without an army, fled along the Caspian coast. In late 1221, he reached the deserted island of Abaskun off the coast, lived incognito, and died alone, without fanfare, in utter despair. The king who had ruled from the Sir Darya to the Gulf died a forgotten man. By mid-1221, eastern Persia had been almost completely depopulated. A quarter of the population of Iran is said to have disappeared, and the Mongol sword was now poised to reach the western highlands, where Prince Jalal al-Din, the last son of the Khwarezmian Emperor, was preparing for the final battle on the banks of the Indus. As Shah Muhammad's empire crumbled in flames, the last man brave enough to stand against the Mongols was his eldest son, Jalal al-Din. Suspected by his father and deposed, Jalal now became the last symbol of the Khwarezmian resistance, an outcast prince with unyielding blood. Amid the ruins of Nishapur and Herat, he rallied his remaining troops and retreated to the highlands of eastern Iran, where he hoped to rebuild his forces and counterattack. In late 1221, when news of Shah Muhammad's death at Abaskun Island spread, Jalal al-Din formally proclaimed himself king, vowing to continue the fight. He quickly captured Ghazni, the gateway from Khorasan to India, and rebuilt his army from the survivors. Local infantry, Turkish cavalry, and Kurdish, Tajik, and Hindu mercenaries who had been swept up in the fighting. In early 1222, Jalal al-Din turned west, toward the Punjab, where he believed he could find allies, or at least a strong rear to hold out against the Mongol onslaught. But Genghis Khan would not let him retreat so easily. After retreating from Samarkand and Bukhara, Jalal al-Din, the surviving son of Shah Ala ad-Din, emerged as the last glimmer of hope for a crumbling empire. Leading the remnants of the Khwarezmian army, he crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and marched southeastward toward Kabul, aiming to open a path into India. Along the way, however, he learned that a Mongol detachment under General Shiki Kutug, composed of some 30,000 elite cavalry, was in pursuit. This Mongol force had departed from the Kapisa region and was advancing rapidly through the Salang Pass toward the Parwan Valley, north of Kabul, in modern-day Afghanistan. Jalal al-Din, though commanding only 10,000 to 12,000 men, mostly local infantry and Turkic Persian cavalry, refused to flee. Instead, he chose to make a stand in the rugged mountainous terrain of Parwan, where steep slopes and narrow passes would neutralize the Mongols' famed cavalry mobility. Over 3 fierce days of battle, around late September or early October 1221, Jalal al-Din employed classic guerrilla tactics: ambushes from high ground, disruption of supply lines, and feigned retreats to lure the enemy into deadly traps. When the Mongol cavalry pushed deep into narrow gorges, Khwarezmian archers rained arrows from both flanks. Whenever the Mongols tried to reorganize and counterattack, they were struck from the sides by hidden cavalry units positioned behind the hills. The battlefield shifted constantly, but the terrain always favored Jalal al-Din. Eventually, the Mongol detachment fell into complete disarray, with commanders unable to maintain communication. General Shiki-Kutug was severely wounded and killed while trying to rally his troops. By nightfall, the Mongol force had been shattered, and the survivors fled back toward Kapisa. This was the first and last major Khwarezmian victory over the Mongols in the entire campaign. The triumph at Parwan was not only a tactical success, but a symbolic blow to the seemingly invincible reputation of Genghis Khan's army, which had stormed through Transoxiana and Balkh in under a year. But this spark of glory would not last long. News of the defeat soon reached Genghis Khan's main camp in Bactria. Enraged, the great Khan personally assembled a hand-picked strike force, crossing through Bamiyan in hot pursuit of Jalal al-Din. What followed would become one of the most dramatic final stands in medieval history, the Battle of the Indus. After his victory at Parwan, Jalal al-Din led his army and a large group of refugees and civilians southward, aiming to cross the Indus River into the Indian subcontinent. The plan was clear: retreat beyond Genghis Khan's reach and rebuild a base of power in India. But the Mongols were relentless. By early spring 1222, Genghis Khan himself had led an elite army in pursuit, moving swiftly through Bamiyan and the Khyber Pass, burning villages and leaving no haven behind. Jalal al-Din, now near the banks of the swollen Indus River, realized he had little time. Behind him, the Mongols were closing in. In front, the Indus was in flood, wide and treacherous. Refusing to abandon his people, Jalal al-Din established a defensive position on the elevated ridges along the river, placing what remained of his army, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 men, in a semicircle around the civilian camp. He was determined to buy time for as many refugees as possible to cross the river on rafts and boats. Then the Mongols struck. Genghis Khan launched a multi-pronged assault, a frontal cavalry charge using heavily armored lancers and simultaneous flanking attacks aimed at cutting off any retreat. Despite being outnumbered, Jalal al-Din fought valiantly, riding at the front of the charge, striking down enemy commanders, and trying to break through the encirclement. But the odds were overwhelming. As Mongol pressure mounted and casualties soared, Jalal al-Din was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision: to kill his mother and wife, lest they fall into enemy hands. A brutal yet tragically common act in medieval warfare. Then, seeing the last boats destroyed and no escape remaining, he spurred his horse and leapt from the riverbank into the Indus, plunging into the cold, violent current. Miraculously, he swam across under a hail of arrows and emerged on the Indian side, wounded, alone, but alive. From a ridge above the battlefield, Genghis Khan is said to have watched the entire scene unfold. Rather than ordering pursuit, he is recorded to have remarked, "That is a man to be respected, the bravest enemy I have ever faced." As Jalal al-Din crossed the Indus and disappeared into the darkness of the Indian subcontinent, Genghis Khan returned to Central Asia, leaving behind a shattered Persian world. But in the northwest, his invisible arms were still stretching, deep into lands where no Mongol horse had ever set foot: the Caucasus, the southern Russian steppes, and even the western shores of the Caspian Sea. The two generals, Subutai and Jebe, who had commanded the southern expedition that broke through Khorasan, did not return from their victory. Instead, they were ordered on a strategic reconnaissance mission around the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus, deep into the lands of the Kipchaks, Alans, Georgians, and Rus, to map out a grand invasion. What followed over the next 2 years was an epic of blood and speed, a raid nearly 9,000 kilometers deep, ending in a fateful battle on the Kalka River. In 1222, Subutai and Jebe led some 20,000 elite cavalry across the Elburz Mountains, advancing towards the Talish region. They quickly defeated the Shirvanshah's army, capturing the city of Derbent, the gateway to the northern Caucasus. When the Alans and Kipchaks formed a large tribal alliance to block them, Subutai pretended to negotiate, bribing the Kipchaks, causing the alliance to collapse from within. The Alans were destroyed, and the Caucasus was wide open. The Mongol army swept like a whirlwind across the Kuban Valley, pouring into the steppe tribes of the northern Black Sea. From there, they encountered a power they had never seen before, the Rus principalities. The Rus princes, the princes of Kiev, Galek, Suzdal, and Chernigov, heard of the approach of the beasts from the east and organized an unprecedented military alliance. More than 80,000 men, under the command of Mstislav of Galicia, Mstislav of Kiev, and other princes, marched east to intercept them. Subutai and Jebe knew they could not fight head-on. They feigned retreat, retreating hundreds of miles across the Donets, luring their enemies into a carefully calculated strategic trap. On May 31st, 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River, the Rus army, exhausted from the long march and divided over command, fell into a perfect ambush. The Mongols suddenly turned and attacked, cutting off the enemy formation. The Rus heavy cavalry was unable to deploy, was caught behind, and was destroyed in clusters. Within hours, the Rus alliance was completely shattered. Mstislav of Kiev and many of his princes were captured alive. According to a gruesome legend, they were forced to lie on the ground, and the Mongols laid planks on them to serve as tables, eating and celebrating their victory, a symbolic act of crushing the enemy's nobility. After Kalka, the Mongols did not advance. They had no supplies to occupy the Rus, nor were they ordered to invade on a full scale. Subutai and Jebe returned to Central Asia after a 9,000-kilometer arc campaign, a military feat unparalleled in history. They brought back not only spoils and glory, but also strategic maps, topography, and political structures of Rus and its surrounding regions. 16 years later, Subutai, now the Grand Marshal of the Mongol army, would return with 150,000 men, beginning his invasion of Eastern Europe in 1236 to 1241. But by this time, in 1223, the Khwarezm campaign was over. A proud empire had been wiped off the map. Half the Muslim world had been burned. Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, the Shah of Shahs, died without fanfare on a deserted island in the middle of the Caspian Sea. His son, Jalal al-Din, tried to rally the remnants of his army and fought on for another decade, but he never succeeded in re-establishing his father's empire. All that remained were empty fortresses, burned cities, and deserted fields. The power centers of Transoxiana, from Otrar, Bukhara to Samarkand, were depopulated en masse. The scholarly oases, which once housed thousands of ancient manuscripts, libraries, and academies, were reduced to ashes. Khorasan, once the cultural heart of Islamic Persia, never regained the luster of its golden age. The destruction of centers of learning such as Nishapur, Merv, and Herat cut off the flow of knowledge that had flourished throughout the Muslim world. Ancient works, medical manuscripts, astronomical manuscripts, and philosophical texts, many of them were never recovered. The intelligentsia was massacred or enslaved. Language, art, and architecture, all were disrupted. What had once been the pinnacle of culture was dragged back into obscurity. According to modern historians, the Mongol campaign killed more than 10 million people in the region, equivalent to more than a quarter of the entire population of Iran, a terrible toll for the pre-modern world. The Silk Road trade collapsed. Ancient irrigation systems, caravanserai, and bazaars were destroyed, not restored, for decades. Agriculture was abandoned, and the land was barren. Settlements were wiped out to the point that they were nameless on maps of the following century. Once thriving lands became deserts, both literally and figuratively. The collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire also created a huge power vacuum between Persia and Central Asia. For many years afterward, the region was in a state of chaos, conflict, and fragmentation. This was why the Mongols easily established Khanates, the Chagatai in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, which became part of the new order the Mongols created. At the same time, the defeat of Khwarezm sent a terrible message to the Muslim world that no stronghold was impregnable and that arrogance, internal divisions, and diplomatic blindness could lead to destruction faster than any military attack. That's the end of today's episode. You've just walked through a blood-soaked chapter of history. From proud Otrar to magnificent Samarkand, from the flames that devoured Bukhara to the ashes that buried Khorasan, these words do more than tell a story. They resurrect a civilization that was wiped from the map. If what you've just read made you feel the weight of time, the screams of fallen cities, and the thunder of Mongol hooves shaking the earth, then don't let this tale vanish as just another whisper lost in the vast noise of the internet. Leave a like, share this story, so its lessons are not buried like the libraries of Merv. And subscribe, follow this page or channel, so we can continue this journey through epic tales. See you on our next adventure.